Today I'm out in Napa finally getting hands-on with the biggest and the most expensive Infiniti ever produced. This is the all-new 2025 QX80, and there's a lot riding on the new Infiniti flagship because this is entering a really competitive segment with a ton of new entries. We have the old guard like the Navigator and the Escalade, of course, but we also have the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer and brand new GXs and LXs from Lexus as well. So how does the Infiniti stack up? Let's find out. As usual, I'll talk more about pricing at the end of the video, but to frame the QX80 discussion properly, we need to set the stage. It's going to start at around $84,500 for 2025, and as we're looking at here, this is the most expensive model at around $112,000. That's right in line with most of the competition, which again includes Wagoneer, Escalade, Navigator, Lexus LX, etc. And size-wise, it's about the same size as all of those options, a little bit bigger than some, a little bit smaller than others. As you'd expect in a full-size luxury SUV, we have a big, bold front end, but it's notably less bubbly than the previous generation QX80, certainly more square all the way around, not just the front. The side profile is definitely more angular with sharper lines, etc. Let me know what you think of the grille. I really like this design. It's certainly bigger than the grille that we find in the Lexus LX, but it looks less hungry to my eye, a little bit more elegant. In the middle of everything, we find the same Infiniti logo we've seen before with a tweak where the road that goes off into the horizon actually is a 3D element that goes into that Infiniti logo. It's a little bit difficult to show on camera, but in person, it does add an extra dimension to the front end. Over here, we have the daytime running lights on top, just under the hood, and then below we have the headlights a little bit lower in the bumper. In the middle of everything, of course, we have the radar adaptive cruise control sensor. Here's a closer look at that Infiniti logo. You can see that the road going off into the distance curves in there towards the center, and then the slats mirror the angle of that Infiniti logo. We then have a counter angle going on here, which definitely gives the grille an interesting 3D appearance, but still looks easier to clean than some of the egg crates out there in this segment. When Infiniti first announced the third generation QX80, a lot of folks were wondering, is it really a third generation, or is it just a new body on top of the old frame? The answer is no, it's a completely redesigned model from the ground up, including a new, stiffer and stronger frame. The body itself, that's longer, wider and taller than before, and certainly squarer, as you can see right here. It does share the same 120-inch wheelbase as the previous generation QX80, but the big difference with the frame, again, is the strength, but also the redesign of the suspension. So we still have a four-corner independent suspension, but we now have the option of a four-corner adaptive air suspension as well. The previous QX80 only had load leveling in the back. The front was a regular steel spring setup. Now, if you want the lower long-term maintenance costs of a regular suspension, you can get the base version of the QX80 that's not going to have the adaptive height functionality, but if you want the easier access or you want extra ground clearance for mild off-roading, then you want the adaptive air suspension. It's going to be able to lower and raise the suspension by about 2 inches or so from this medium height, and this is currently in its normal height setting. Dimensionally, this is almost exactly the same size as the Escalade, the Navigator, and about 11 inches longer than the Lexus LX. Versus a lot of the German competition, specifically the unibody competitors like the X7 and the GLS, you'll notice that interior room is pretty similar, but the roofline is quite a bit higher, and that's simply because of the body-on-frame design. Moving to the rear, we find some pretty significant changes in terms of both design and functionality. Starting out with the design, of course, we have a big LED light bar, but this is a sort of piano key design rather than a continuous light bar like we find in some. It's going to provide startup animations where the lights are going to progress from the center towards the edge, etc. as you approach the vehicle and as you depart. They're full LED modules, including amber LED turn signals below. You'll notice no visible exhaust tips there depending on the angle you're looking at. They're downturned and completely under the bumper. Functionality-wise, there's some big changes here. We no longer have that sort of two-tiered cake-style hatch that's going to improve cargo practicality, especially above the belt line of the QX80, and we now have a bumper that doesn't stick out as far as it did in the past. It still sticks out further than the hatch, of course, giving you a little bit of extra hatch protection, but when the hatch is opened, you'll notice that you're a lot closer to the cargo area. That's going to make cargo loading and unloading an awful lot easier. Also helping that process is a cargo area load floor that is lower than in the previous generation, and that's thanks to that new frame design. As you'd expect from Infiniti, and a little bit different than the German competition, the QX80 has a ton of active driver assistance and active safety tech standard. That helps justify the higher base price versus last year as well. We get adaptive cruise control, forward and reverse autonomous emergency braking, trailer-aware blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic detection, and a ton of other systems standard on every QX80. Optional is going to be a heads-up display. That's the first time it's ever existed in the QX80. We also have the in-car camera, a video recorder, which basically operates as your dash cam if you get into an accident, etc., and the availability of ProPilot 2.1, which is what Infiniti is calling their hands-free driver assistant tech. So this is kind of like Ford's Blue Cruise and Cadillac's Super Cruise system, where if you're on a divided highway with limited access, so think freeways and highways in most areas, you can drive hands off the steering wheel, eyes still on the road. So this is not a fully autonomous system, but it is that next generation in autonomy. Now, one thing to know is that if you want that ProPilot 2.1 system, you cannot get it in the base model. You do have to start stair-stepping up the trim level, and that is going to be optional on most trims. As expected, every QX80 is going to get a twin-turbo V6 under the hood, but this is not the 3-liter turbo 6 from the Q50 and Q60. Instead, it's a new 3.5-liter twin-turbo 6. The reason they designed a new engine for the QX80 is because they wanted more torque. This produces a whopping 516 pound-feet. That's not only more than that QX80 or Q50, it's also 103 pound-feet more than the outgoing V8 engine we found in last year's QX80. It also produces more power, 450 horsepower total, and it's sending that to the ground via the new 9-speed automatic transmission. That's going to give us 20% better fuel economy in both 4-wheel drive and 2-wheel drive models. It's still not the most efficient entry in this segment, but it is significantly better than the outgoing model. The new engine is also going to enable the QX80 to tow up to 8,500 pounds. That's not the highest tow rating in this segment, but it is technically the highest standard tow rating in the segment, and you will find that in every QX80. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we don't get a 2-speed transfer case option in the QX80. So if you're looking for a luxury rugged off-roader, you might want to look towards the Lexus LX or a Range Rover. You will still find 2-speed transfer cases in a number of the competitors, but not in the QX80. As I've come to expect from Infiniti, over a day in the QX80, I found these to be some of the most comfortable seats in this segment. They're wider than average, I would say. We also have a lot of adjustment in this top-end trim, including inflatable side bolsters, 4-way adjustable lumbar support, and available seat massage. It's worth noting, however, that the base trim does not get 4-way lumbar, and that is something I found surprising. I would like to see them all have 4-way rather than 2-way lumbar, although most of the versions everybody's going to be buying, it's actually going to be more like the one I'm in here. We also have a power adjustable tilt telescopic steering column with 2-position memory over there on the door, and the front passenger seat has the exact same range of motion in this top-end trim, including the 2-position memory. Now, on the subject of massage, this is not the most aggressive massage available in this segment, and it does time out just like everybody else's, but I would say it's better than the massage that we find in the Navigator. Thanks to the new body and the new frame, this QX80 has a significant improvement in legroom over the previous generation. It's about 7 inches more, front row plus second row plus third row, and it's immediately noticeable when you hop inside. This front seat's comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. It's actually a little bit further reclined than I might normally sit, but I still have tons of legroom here in the second row. This model has powered second row seats, and these seats also feature the available massage functionality. One thing we don't find, however, that you will see in some of the competition is a 4-zone climate control system. Instead, we just have a 3-zone here, but we do find heated and ventilated second row seats in this model as well. There's tons of headroom in the back, but not as much headroom as we find in some of the competition. This is actually a little bit lower than average. And if I put this seat in its upright position, I think you may notice it. I have maybe about an inch of clearance between my head and the ceiling, mainly because of this enormous panoramic moonroof that we have in every QX80. Click that twice to get the shade to go all the way to the back. The way that Infiniti decided to design this panoramic moonroof, however, I think is the reason for the headroom limitation. The front glass pane actually drops down and goes on the inside, so we have this pretty chunky track right here that does eat up some of the headroom. But the seats, they're pretty comfortable. They also have another trick up their sleeve. If I just sit on the center console, if I click this button here, this is one of the few entries in this segment where you could leave a forward-facing child seat latch anchored into position and still easily get back here into the third row. There is a lot of room. Infiniti is very proud to say, if I can hop over here, that this has the widest opening to the third row in the segment, and I definitely believe it. Now, it is worth noting that there are a few other options in this segment where you can leave a child seat latch anchored into place. The roomiest, of course, is going to be the Wagoneer and the Grand Wagoneer, but you can also do it in some of the Ford full-size SUVs as well. But you can't in something like the Cadillac or, of course, the Lexus. It means that getting in and out of the third row for adults or for people with limited mobility is going to be an awful lot easier. If you're the kind of person that finds yourself forgetting to put the seats back into position when you've taken your cargo out, you'll be happy to know that you can actually do that from the driver's side. Now, back here in the third row, this seat is not quite all the way back in position. If you move the seats forward and then backward, they're automatically going to default to a position that gives the rear passengers just about 2 inches of extra legroom. But even with this seat all the way back in its tracks, you can see I still have a reasonable amount of legroom left, a significant improvement over the outgoing model. At this point in time, Infiniti has not given me official headroom figures back here. However, there is plenty of room and we get air vents up here in the ceiling. You can see I have maybe about a 1/4 inch of headroom left if I sit upright in the third row. Not quite as much room as some, but on the other hand, the seat bottom cushion is higher off the ground than the Infiniti QX60 and it's notably wider as well. So if you put 3 people in the back here, they're going to be an awful lot more comfortable than in the average mid-size luxury SUV. One solid reason to get this. Also, we have a completely flat floor back here, so no weird driveline hump for the middle third row passenger. Going in for a closer look, we have a relatively large pillar there in the rear that is going to limit visibility for the third row passengers, although keep in mind these seats are probably going to spend most of their time folded, which is why we find harder plastics back here just like we find in most of the competition. Hard plastic side, hard plastic armrest right there, but we do have 2 big cup holders here, a USB-C charge point on each side, the power recline mechanism for the third row, and the seat heating option right there. If you're a fan of latch anchors, there are 3 sets in here, 1 in the third row on the passenger side, and then of course 1 each for the outboard second row positions. Speaking of the second row, because we are in the top end trim, we have an extra LCD here for controlling the climate control zone back here. Also controls up there in that center console, of course. And then if I go back to the home menu, this is also where we find controls for the heated and ventilated seats and the powered seat adjustment. Between the power hatch and the third row seats, we now have 22 cubic feet of cargo capacity. That's a pretty significant improvement over the 16 cubic feet that we found last year. A lot of that has to do with the squareness of the profile. The opening has become squarer, the hatch has become squarer, and the distance between the hatch and that rear seat has also become larger. That's where that room comes from. But they also improved the room between the hatch and the second row seat if you have the third row seat folded, and between the hatch and the first row seat if you have all of those rows of seats folded. So lots of room going on back here. On this side, there is a 120 volt inverter outlet. It's just 150 watts in rating, so no running a microwave or anything like that. Behind that little hatch, there's some additional storage space on the side. On the other side, we have the air intake for the rear climate control zone, some buttons to raise and lower the suspension to make access a little bit easier for cargo, and then buttons to power fold and unfold the second and third rows. Under the floor, we have a little bit of additional storage space, and going further down the rabbit hole, that's where we find the jack. What about a spare tire? I'm glad you asked. That's tucked up right there underneath the QX80. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the top end trim, so there are going to be things in here that we don't find in the base model, like the optional cameras located over here and over here. That's to enable that dash cam-like recording functionality where it takes pictures on the inside and on the outside. And for some reason, if you wanted to, you can also take selfies with the camera as well. We have slide to the side sun visors, and again, this big panoramic moonroof that extends to just about the second row passengers' heads. Lots of speakers are going on in this interior. This has the 24 speaker sound system, which does sound incredible. Speakers right there above those doors, over here above the driver and front passenger doors as well. Then of course we have speakers in the headrest, or maybe I should say headdress, because this actually gives me kind of an Egyptian headdress theme with the speaker grill that wraps from one side all the way to the other. This is part of the up-level Klipsch Reference Premier audio system that features 24 speakers, and it definitely gives this a very distinctive look. Of course, we have the Autograph logo embossed on that leather upholstery as well. Of course, the front passenger also has that same sort of headdress style speaker grill, but we don't find anything back there in the second row seats. For the driver, it functions not just as surround sound, but also speakers for turn-by-turn navigation directions and, of course, your phone. Here's a better look at the general seat design. Again, they're a little bit wider than average in this segment, I would say. And I really like this two-tone charcoal and red design. Let me know what you think about that. Moving over to the front doors, lots of premium materials are happening up here. Lots of stitched materials going on up top for that armrest, that soft touch. And then most of the door panel is made from soft touch materials, except for the area right there around that lower speaker grill. We do find some hard plastics to improve durability down there. On the front doors, we find a large wood trim panel with laser cut metal inlays. You can see the ambient lighting is currently set to red right there. That kind of matches the rest of the red going on inside. And then moving over to the dashboard, you'll see another part of the ambient lighting system, which are these illuminated little stripes here in this piano black section of the dashboard. We also have an illuminated Infiniti logo. It's a little bit difficult to see in this particular lighting condition. Lots of stitched materials going on the dashboard as well, the upper and the lower. The glove box is a little bit smaller than we find in the X7 or the GLS, but these screens in the dashboard, they are definitely bigger, just over 14 inches each. Let's take a look at the one in the middle first. Obviously, this is going to be where we'll find smartphone integration, so Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. The two screens are separated by this little 5mm wide blackout section. I sort of wish this was either one big screen like we find in the Cadillacs, or they had just been able to squish them a little bit closer together perhaps. But I like the fact that they operate as if it was one big screen. I'll show you that in just a second. Obviously, smartphone integration right there, pretty typical. This has Google built in, so we now have the Google Assistant. We also have Google Mapping with satellite imagery, and it's being driven by a faster processor for better animations, better screen transitions, etc. It's very rapid as far as the screen motions, and you can download a ton of different apps like the Amazon Alexa app. We have the Dash Cam app right there, so if we want to go and take a look at that, you can also flip around and see the inside camera. So hey, there I am holding my camera, looking at the camera. That's kind of meta there. And then you can record, you can also take a photo and view photos, things like that. But talking about cameras, this is where things are kind of cool. So if I hit the camera button, we get pretty typical Infiniti 360-degree camera layouts, forward, backward, etc. I can go over here and click this forward view, and here's where we get an extra option. I can expand that out, and then I can use both screens to see forward. This actually is handier than I thought. The QX80 is pretty big, and that hood, it's pretty long. So if you find yourself in a tricky situation where you're looking around a corner, you can actually use this because the cameras are much further forward in the vehicle. You can actually use it to look around that corner before you enter an intersection. You can of course just shrink it down with that button there and just use the center screen if you want to. Now over here on this side, we have our pretty typical instrument cluster. It's of course configurable. Those controls are over here on the steering wheel, and there are a few different views to choose from. We move around here, it's a touch and physical button bank. So we click over to the settings option right there, and then there is a meter view option where we can find things like the dynamic meter view. The enhanced layout is my favorite view because this map is being driven by my Apple smartphone. So if I hit go there for that routing, you'll notice that we now have mapping and routing information here in the middle in addition to that center screen. And of course, if I unplug my phone, it's going to go back to the built-in Google navigation maps. Moving out from there, we find the new steering wheel design. It's definitely sort of an eccentric design versus before, but I think it's really comfortable. Nice and thickly rimmed, sport grips up top. This sort of flat bottom and slightly flat top area is really cool. The touch and physical buttons here again for the active safety systems and driver assist systems, so add adaptive cruise control and the aggressive lane centering software there. We have a lane change button there. On this side we have the controls for that multifunction LCD, and you can use this also to control the LCD infotainment system if you want to do that rather than reaching over there for the touchscreen. Moving all the way over to this side, we find a little button bank here for the steering assist system, auto start, stop, enable, disable, the heads-up display. You can see that head-up display is right there. That's what it looks like on there. It's a little bit difficult to film, but it is a large full-color display. Continuing down the dashboard, we have the start-stop button there, big air vents. I like the fact that we have some fixed in place forward-backward buttons for the infotainment system and a physical volume knob. They're discreetly concealed there between those two air vents. We then have a pretty decently sized LCD right here in the middle of the dashboard. This sort of actually looks like the in-dash instrument panel or infotainment system panel that we find in a wide variety of more mainstream vehicles, only here it's just for the climate control and some of the drive mode settings. So snow mode, eco mode, etc. You can control the four-wheel drive system there and the air suspension, but it's probably going to spend most of its time in this climate control mode. There's no storage space under it. It kind of curves in there, but then we have a small storage space under the entire center console where you can put small bags or things like that. Then moving back from there, we have a place where you can put your smartphone. I got all sorts of stuff in this little cubby at the moment, but we do have a wireless charging mat. Had no problem charging through some of those thicker cases. And we have some USB-C charge ports and interface ports for the smartphone integration, and all that will actually stuff itself behind that lid, which is kind of surprising. Lots of room in there. 2 cup holders over here on this side. I kind of wish that they were maybe flip-flopped, and maybe the cup holders were a little bit closer to the driver's side, but I suppose that could be handier for passengers over there. Then over here we have a cool box in this particular model. You can toggle it on with that switch. Then we basically have a refrigerated compartment for your water or your sodas, etc., and a place where you can stick your key if you're interested. All right, everybody, it's time to get the QX80 out on the road, and you are definitely going to notice the new adaptive air suspension probably first thing right off the bat, unless of course you get the base trim. Although Infiniti is saying that they expect the base model to be probably less than 5% of sales. Pretty much everybody is going to be getting a QX80 that rides right like this one. Now, with an adaptive 4-corner air suspension, you might assume this would drive like a marshmallow, but it's actually firmer than I had expected. I would say that something like the Wagoneer with the air suspension or the Escalade with its adaptive air suspension actually delivers a slightly more plush ride than this. There's very little body roll. There's actually relatively little tip and dive for a full-size SUV. We're not talking Nissan GTR here, of course. We're talking big SUV anyway. The next thing you're obviously going to notice is the 3.5-liter twin-turbo V6. This model in our preliminary testing out here in Napa, bearing in mind not on our own home test surface, 88 degrees outside, etc., it went 0 to 60 just over 6.1 seconds. So we're talking pretty decent performance for this segment. No Cadillac CTS-V competitor here, and not quite as much power as we find in the Wagoneer with the new Hurricane engine, but actually slightly better 0 to 60 performance than the last Wagoneer that I was able to test with that engine. I think it all has to do with the turbo lag due to the slightly smaller displacement we find in the Jeep. It's worth noting, of course, that we find a relatively similar displacement in the Lincoln Navigator and its 3.5-liter twin-turbo 6. As far as handling goes, the QX80 definitely drives smaller than you might expect. It's definitely a willing partner out here on these winding roads, although obviously in narrow situations like this gate up here, the size of the QX80 is going to become obvious. Now, that's not to mean that this handles like a BMW X7. Keep in mind that some of the competition, especially the X7 and the GLS, they're based on unibody designs, and that generally means better handling, lower center of gravity, and obviously those models are going to offer higher performance for a larger price tag. That's another important factor. Keep in mind that even though the price tag of this QX80 is above the previous generation, it actually is a notable amount lower, especially versus the X7 and the GLS. I know a lot of folks on our Facebook page were worried about the lack of the V8 engine, because it was one of the best V8s in this segment, if I'm honest. It was one of the thirstiest, but it had a fantastic sound and a whole lot of power. Honestly, I think this 3.5-liter engine is a worthy replacement, as is this 9-speed automatic transmission. There is a little bit of a shifting lag, a little bit of turbo lag as you'd expect in a turbo engine, but it has a solid sound to it. And that's something that we should expect, of course, because Infiniti's V6s have always sounded pretty decent, and the 3-liter in the Q50 and the Q60 has a fantastic sound as well. It's a little bit gruffer than some folks might like. I would definitely say if you're after the ultimate in quiet cruising, you want something like the turbocharged Wagoneer. That 3-liter is really, really quiet, but this, I think it actually fits the personality of the QX80 a little bit better. It's a little bit more engaging, it's a little bit smaller, especially versus the extended wheelbase luxury options. And if you want a little bit more sport, Infiniti says there is a sport trim coming soon. Before we get to pricing, let's wrap up the QX80. I think this is exactly what Infiniti needed to do for their flagship. It has the nicest interior ever put into an Infiniti. I love the wood accents in a segment where Lexus is definitely starting to ditch the real wood trim. We of course get real wood in the LX, but you won't find real tree at all in the Lexus GX, or of course the Lexus TX. Interestingly, I would say this competes pretty well with the TX, GX, and LX, even though this is only really targeted at the Lexus LX, that larger full-size body-on-frame vehicle in the Lexus lineup. If you want a big and accommodating third row, that third row is definitely bigger than the one that we find in the GX, and actually I think more comfortable in some ways than what we find in the Lexus TX as well, although headroom is a little bit more limited than that big Lexus crossover. Then of course we get the added towing capability, 8,500 pounds in here. That's the highest standard towing capacity in this segment, but you will find 10,000 pounds of towing capacity in something like the Wagoneer if you get the V8 engines that are still out there. It goes down a little bit for the inline 6 that's now the only one on offer. Versus the German alternatives, those are certainly going to be more engaging on-road, they're going to be more powerful and quieter, but you're not going to get the same level of standard feature content that we find in this. And that really is still the name of the game for the Infiniti QX80. There is a lot of value. Now, I know the concept of a $100,000 value luxury entry may seem baffling to some people, and admittedly, I scratch my head just a little bit when I say that, but even in this segment, people may be looking for, what is my dollar getting me? And remember, inflation means that a $100,000 car doesn't really mean what it once used to, and pretty much every competitor to this gets well over $100,000. If you load up a short wheelbase Grand Wagoneer, you get over $120,000 or so. Most of the competition is going to either start right around here or actually higher than the QX80. But few of the competitors will give you the kind of feature content, power, towing capability, etc. that we find in the QX. Most of them aren't going to have seats quite as comfortable either. But of course, let us know what you think about all that down there in the comment section. If you're looking to get your hands on the new QX80, these are going to be on dealer lots starting in July of 2024. And again, it's going to start more expensive than last year. $82,450 plus a nearly $2,000 destination charge gets you essentially to $84,500 plus tax, title, license, etc. Now you should know that the Pure model, which is the base trim, lacks the air suspension that we find in this model. It also doesn't have real leather, it has imitation leather upholstery, and it doesn't have four-way adjustable lumbar support or the heads-up display. Those features not available on the Pure trim. You also cannot get the ProPilot 2.1 system. However, I do think that the Pure trim is pretty well equipped because a lot of what you see on this model still happens on that Pure trim. You still get the same 3.5-liter twin-turbo 6, the same 9-speed automatic transmission. You can of course get four-wheel drive on that model as well. The twin LCD instrument cluster on the inside is still standard, as is the 8,500 pounds of towing capacity. Although, rather unusually, no version of the QX80 is going to have a trailer brake controller from the factory. That's something that I would love to see on this model. If you're concerned about the long-term maintenance costs of an air suspension, you're going to want to stick with the Pure trim. If, however, you want the best riding QX80, you're going to want Luxe or above, which has the same air suspension we find on this Autograph model. The Luxe trim is $89,550 plus, again, a $1,995 destination charge, so a decent bump over that Pure model. But we get improved upholstery on the inside, the adaptive air suspension, which is not just adaptive height, but also adaptive damping capable, and we get ventilated first and second row seats. That model is also the first one that's going to have the hands-off-the-wheel driving assistance system, ProPilot 2.1. So if you want that option, you have to step up at least to Luxe and then add that option on top of it. If you want even better leather, the 24-speaker audio system we find in this model, massaging seats, ambient lighting, and real wood trim, then you want to check out the sensory trim. That's going to be $100,645, again plus destination. But oddly enough, that sensory trim does not have the ProPilot 2.1 system standard. It's still an option. If you're interested in the ultimate Infiniti, then you want the Autograph model. That's going to add massaging second row seats in addition to the massaging first row seats. We get more LCD real estate on the inside, the unique styling elements on the inside and outside, but we also have a $110,595 starting price on that trim, plus of course destination and the extra paint options depending on what you select. On the other hand, ProPilot Assist 2.1 becomes standard on that model. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, oh my God, that's an awful lot of cash, and it is, but it's also pretty similar to the competition. So let me pull out my handy dandy cheat sheet here, and let's just run through those competitors really quickly. Escalade, $81,895, a little bit less expensive than this. Navigator, bit more expensive than this starting. Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer, hold on to your hats, folks. Grand Wagoneer starts at $93,945 plus destination. So that Jeep is actually going to be a bit more expensive starting than the corollary QX80. You will find more standard feature content in that Grand Wagoneer, however, but any way you slice it, it's going to be pricier than this. Then the Lexus LX, $92,565. The GX, it is about 20 grand less expensive than this. It's not as nice on the inside, however. The X7 and the GLS, they start right around this, with the GLS actually starting a few $1,000s more than the base QX80. That means that Infiniti has priced this, I think, right in the sweet spot for the full-size luxury SUV segment. Now, whether or not you think it has the style or the brand cachet to command $100,000, I think it certainly has the parts content and the feature content to command $100,000. On the inside, we definitely find a more luxurious interior than we find in the Lexus GX. It's a significant step up in terms of both parts quality and I think styling as well. The interior also feels significantly more modern modern than the Navigator. Remember, the Navigator is due for a complete redesign here soon, so that's probably going to change. And I would say this actually is pretty competitive to certain versions of the Escalade. Keep in mind the Escalade does get quite expensive and there's a big variety of Escalade to choose from, but I think this competes pretty well against the bulk of the Escalade and even the Wagoneer lineup as well. Most folks, however, I think they're really going to be in a two-way race between the Lexus LX and the Infiniti QX80. Those are the two classic competitors for Infiniti and Lexus. And if my money were on the line, I have to admit, I would probably buy this over the Lexus LX. I think the style, inside and outside, and the comfort appeals to me more. I find the seats more comfortable than the Lexus LX. I like the audio system, it's pretty cool there as well. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what would you cross-shop against the QX80. For the rest of you, if you think this is too expensive, hang on, because we all know there's going to be a Nissan Armada coming at some point in the future. It's going to share at least the frame with the QX80, like we find in the other body-on-frame entries in this segment with more of a mainstream connection. It's probably going to share a very similar engine. We don't know exact details there, but you can bet the interior is not going to be as premium, and it's going to look different on the outside as well. If you're impatient, there are definitely some spy shots and some renderings out there where you can see what the Armada and the Patrol might look like once it gets released, probably a little bit later this year. Nissan, of course, has not said anything at all about that model, and Infiniti is not going to comment either because it's not an Infiniti. At any rate, let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and stay tuned because we will get that to you just as soon as we get more information. See all of you next week.